Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Brainwash Festival, the weekend where we're talking about tomorrow's economy. And right now at this event, we're going to talk about surveillance capitalism. My name is Haroon Sheikh. I'm a philosopher working at VU University in Amsterdam, as well as the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. And tonight it is my honor to have a conversation with Professor Shoshana Zuboff. Let me introduce her. Scholar, writer, and activist Shoshana Zuboff is the author of 3 major books, each of which signaled the start of a new epoch in technological society. Her recent masterwork, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, has been hailed as the tech industry's silent spring and thus capital of the 21st century. Zuboff is the Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School. Professor Zuboff, very welcome.
Thank you so much, Haroon. I'm so excited to be here with you and all of our participants today.
Very much looking to forward towards the conversation. I must say the book also, apart from the other references, also makes me think a lot about Thomas Piketty's Das Kapital, not just because of the size of the book, but also because I think both books really talk about a really important social issue that I think everyone has some inkling of, that something profound is happening, but we don't really have the words. We don't really have the deep analysis, and I think that's what your book provides with surveillance capitalism, and I'm really looking forward to diving into depths of this, the topic of your book.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Haroon.
Also to the audience, very welcome. I'm inviting you also to join the conversation. You can do this through the Ask a Question button on your screen, and I will see them here on the tablet in front of me, and I'll do my best to bring in as much as possible the questions that you raise into our conversation. So, I don't think everyone will have had the opportunity to really read in its entirety your book. So maybe just to start off, Professor Zuboff, or we said we could discuss name each other by the first name, Shoshana?
Yes, please.
What is surveillance capitalism? What is this technology that is being propagated currently by these big tech companies?
All right. So a tiny bit of background, just a sentence or two. You know, capitalism has evolved over the centuries by taking things that live outside the market economy and bringing them into the market economy, calling them commodities, things that can be sold and purchased. So famously, you know, industrial capitalism claimed nature for the market dynamic. So land became real estate, or nature rather became land, became real estate, things that could be sold and purchased. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, and you know, a lot of people, a lot of economists had said early on in the 21st century that, gee, everything that can become a commodity has become a commodity. You know, we don't really see any other, you know, big opportunities for capitalism to evolve. But then we had Silicon Valley, and we had the internet startups in Silicon Valley, and ultimately, 2000, 2001, we had something called the dot-com bust. And what happened there was a lot of emergency, a lot of crisis, a lot of brilliant young people with startups desperately looking for a way to get over this hump from just having a little company to actually being able to practice capitalism. And that meant they needed that commodity to create the dynamism, to create the opportunity for profit. It was at Google, in the heat of financial emergency, that it was discovered that personal information could become the next commodity. Our personal information could become the next thing that was dragged from where it lived in our private lives into a new market space where it could be manufactured, sold, and purchased. So let's just examine these 2 words for a tiny moment: surveillance capitalism. These 2 words are juxtaposed here, you know, not to create a sense of melodrama, but for a very specific purpose. Surveillance capitalism, let's focus on capitalism for a moment, because what we have here are many of the key elements of traditional capitalism. We have, for example, private property. We have the drive for economic growth. We have profit, revenue and profit. We have market exchange. So many of the things that have defined capitalism throughout the ages are here, those core elements. However, the twist is that these elements cannot be fully realized. They cannot be successful without the social relations and technologies of surveillance. Because what this means now is that hidden methods of observation and data capture are designed to secretly sort of creep up on our private experience, invade our private experience, and from it lift raw material, a free source of raw material now. Our lives become this free source of raw material that is then translated into behavioral data. What is extraordinary in this is that in these very immediate and fast and secretive operations, the behavioral data drawn from what we imagine as our private lives, those behavioral data are immediately claimed as the private property of these corporations. They are immediately claimed as corporate assets, the new commodities for sale and purchase. So this is a kind of crazy, unexpected, startling twist that has crept up on us largely because it's been so well hidden. But the one thing I want to make clear here is that the essence of my work, the essence of the theory of surveillance capitalism, is to contest the property claims of these companies. And what I'm saying is that essentially personal information is the stolen treasure, surveillance is the getaway car, and the entire economic edifice, which now rolls across the normal economy in every economic sector, that entire economics rests on this fundamentally illegitimate bed of sand.
Because I think that's really important thing you raise here. I mean, we're going to dive into the dynamics more in a moment. I think one of the things you say here is this is really something that was invented after the dot-com bust. So this is not something that's inherent in our digital system. In your book, you describe we too often focus on what you call the puppets, and we should look at the puppet masters. What does that mean?
I'm so glad that you brought this into our conversation right up front, Haroon, because this is a really big deal. So I'm going to say it, and you're going to, everybody's going to roll their eyes and say, well, isn't that obvious? But let's talk about it. The really big deal here is that surveillance capitalism is not technology. We are not talking about data. We are not talking about digital technologies. Data is not our enemy. It's our friend. Digital technologies are not our enemy. They should serve us. The problem here is an economic logic that is fundamentally anti-democratic, that has essentially hijacked the digital and all of the data that it produces, hijacked this whole milieu for its own aims, to achieve its own economic objectives. And the reason that I say it's so important is that over the last 2 decades, as surveillance capitalism has rooted and flourished in every dimension of our lives, the mantra coming out of these companies, the gaslighting mantra, is always, hey, this is how the internet works. This is how search works. This is how social media connection works. What you're experiencing is simply, the progress of technology in the 21st century. This is how the digital works. So you better belt up and get over it. There's no room for complaint here, because do any of you dare to get out in front of the train of technological progress? Do any of you dare risk being called a Luddite? I think not. This is how we have been intimidated and silenced. It's not the only rhetorical strategy for those aims, but it's a big one. Nothing about surveillance capitalism is inevitable. Nothing.
Great. And I really would like to come back to what kind of alternatives there are. Maybe first, I'd like to dive into an analogy you make, and you mentioned it just before. You make a contrast between surveillance capitalism and what we had in the past called industrial capitalism. And there you say, well, both are about the process of commodification, of using something, manipulating it, really bringing it into the economy. And in the past, industrial capitalism, since the Industrial Revolution, did this to nature. And now, the exact same process you just said is happening to human experience. So my question would be, with industrial capitalism, we've had things like oil spills and pollution and monoculture. So what are the equivalents of these disasters, of this dynamic now being applied to human experience? What is the mining accident of surveillance capitalism?
Well, we're living it right now. All right, so you know, in industrial capitalism, I mean, the industrial age, as we all intuitively understand, I mean, that was about, you know, the whole social order was about, you know, what do you do? What is your occupation? What is your work? And so, you know, the great sociologist Durkheim, as a very young man at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, you know, he conceptualized the division of labor in society, because in the early factory, you know, productivity was enhanced with that, what we call the division of labor. Everybody, you know, had parceled out the tasks and so on. But what he saw was that became the overall way to think about the society itself. Society itself was becoming organized according to a division of labor. In the old world, you know, people had natural solidarity. You grew up with the same tribe, with the same traditions, you know, in the same kinship system. But now in an industrial world, everybody was scattered, and, you know, they didn't work at home. They worked in factories. Everything changed. What held people together? What held them together was a division of labor, the new modality of social solidarity and social order. That was Durkheim's huge breakthrough as a young man, to have this great vision and insight. Very radical. Anyway, point is that now, fast forward to the 21st century, we are no longer an industrial society or even an industrial civilization. We are now an information civilization. And from a division of labor, we shift to a division of learning. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? These are the great issues of the distribution of knowledge, the authority over that distribution, and the power to defend that authority. This is what our social order is becoming now in an information civilization. Who knows? Who decides? Who decides? Who decides? And I'm referring to this now in the context of surveillance capitalism, that surveillance capitalism, what we understand now is that precisely because of these hidden operations of the massive extraction of human-generated data at scale, everything that we talked about before in defining surveillance capitalism, how they take our lives as raw material, that must happen at scale for them to produce their products and sell them in their unique markets, which we can also talk about. But the point here is that we expected this to be a golden age of the democratization of knowledge. Surprisingly, what we're finding now is that because of this economic imperative for massive scale extraction of human data, these companies have created a whole new axis of social inequality. Instead of democratization of knowledge, we have huge concentrations of knowledge, especially knowledge about people, and that means us. Knowledge about people concentrated in the domain of private surveillance capital. And that is measured by the growing abyss between what I can know and what can be known about me. And of course, the more knowledge about me, the more things that can be done to me through that knowledge, with that knowledge. So there is also this growing gap between what I can do and what can be done to me through the manipulation of that knowledge. So this is what we are living through now, a shift to an information civilization, but where the social order is dominated by the concentrations of knowledge and power of a handful of companies and the immense wealth that they have been able to accrue and the power that goes with all of that.
And so to really get a feel of the profound danger that's inherent in this, what's the far horizon? I mean, with industrial capitalism, we've had after decades, more than a century, we now have the dynamic of climate change. So here also, what would be the large disaster if this dynamic isn't challenged? What kind of future does this hold?
Okay. Well, that's so insightful of you to say if it isn't challenged, because you know the big question that I began with, and literally I ask myself this question, 1,000 times a day, capitalism in the digital century could have evolved in millions of different ways. It could have evolved in ways that not only serve us, serve our societies, but advance the cause of democracy, advance the values and aspirations of democratic societies. And instead, we've seen just the opposite. And why is that the case? And the reason is that democracy has not yet intervened to challenge and to change this, to challenge and to outlaw. Democracy has not intervened to evolve a vision of a democratic digital century. What does it mean to design and deploy digital technologies in ways that advance the democratic prospect? In the absence of that, should this hegemony that I've been describing, this epistemic dominance of the surveillance capitalists, should this be allowed to not only continue, but of course to grow, then we're looking at a very different future, Haroon, from the one that any of us have imagined, from the one that any of us would choose. This is a future where computational governance displaces democratic governance. It's a future of what I call instrumentarian power, where the power that accrues to private capital in the scenario that I've described, it works its will through the digital medium, through the medium of digital instrumentation, through the data that flows through the global digital architectures, the networks and the connected devices. So it comes to us through this medium, and it learns from all of the knowledge it has about us. It learns how to tune and herd and shape our behavior according to its algorithmic parameters, which, according to computational governance now, displace the living forms of democratic governance, where people come together and discuss together and decide how we want to live together, and we decide the rules and rights and laws that will make our lives flourish. This gives way, these democratic processes give way to computational governance by algorithm. There's a lot that we can say about this, but it certainly means that we no longer look forward to a democratic future. And not only at the level of superstructure, Haroon, but at the level of what kind of people are we? How do we come to think about our human nature? You know, what computational governance does is it displaces democratic contest and debate with certainty. The aim is to always approximate certainty, because certainty is the outcome of computational governance.
Yes, here you're touching the topic of instrumentarianism. I'd like to go back in a moment. There's a question here from the audience I'd like to pose relating really to this. Paul is asking about internalized values, asking us also, I think, about the way we as citizens, what role we have. He asks, have we internalized the values of companies like Facebook and Amazon as if they are our own? And was that their strategy?
Well, I don't think you have, at least many people have not, but it was and is their strategy. Make no mistake about it. You know, somebody said to me the other day, referring to Facebook and its founder, chief executive Mark Zuckerberg, they said, oh, you know, he's like this child that, you know, has always gotten what he wants, and he always, you know, just demands what he wants, and he doesn't understand this world that he's creating and all the dangers. And I had to, no, that's not true. I can assure you, Mr. Zuckerberg and the other leaders in this space, these are very smart people who do understand exactly what they're doing. I think it's important to insert here for a moment, Haroon, the economic imperative, because that's kind of the widget that goes in the middle here, without which we can't understand the origins and the ultimate consequences. Mm-hmm. Very briefly, what happens to all of this, this behavioral data that they illegitimately take from our lives? Well, the data travel through complex supply chains. They go into the new factories. That's where the raw materials go to factories. And it's the same today. These are computational factories. What happens there? Well, in these factories, they produce products, but very specifically, they produce prediction products. They produce predictions of our behavior. These predictions are sold to their customers, not to us. Their customers are business customers with a keen interest in knowing what we will do soon and later.
This is actually, sorry, you have a really fantastic quote on this, so I would like to bring in this here, because in your book you say, well, I mean, we used to think that we were the customers of these companies. Now I think it's very common for people to say, well, if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. But in the third part of your book, you actually say it's way worse than that, right? You have a metaphor that's actually worse than being the product. What are we for these companies?
Well, I say that we are the abandoned carcass. So if you think of, you know, they take behavioral signals from us outside of our awareness, they turn that into behavioral data and ultimately compute that into predictions of what we will do in the future. They have no interest in our actual problems. They have no interest in our actual lives. They have an interest in predicting our behavior because that is what they monetize. That's what they sell to their business customers in these new markets that trade in our futures. Human futures become commodities traded in these human futures markets, just like we have commodity markets that trade in pork futures or oil futures or wheat futures. So as far as what are my problems, what are my community's problems, what are my society's problems, what are Earth's problems, that's not on the menu. So what I get to in the sentence that you like there, Haroon, is I say, we are the abandoned carcass. I love elephants so much, and I'm a huge champion of elephants and of all animals, but I love elephants. So the whole idea of, taking the tusk and leaving the abandoned carcass this is something that has haunted me all my life. And then I realized that that is exactly the position that we are in. They leave all of our flesh and blood, our real lives and our real problems behind in order to grab the tusk and turn that into treasure. This is pernicious, to say the least. And that's why all of these data that they're collecting, these huge concentrations of knowledge, are not used to improve our lives or fix our most chronic social problems or cure the problems of climate crisis, but rather to create prediction products, to monetize, to sell to business customers. And this means that they are selling certainty. And this means that their profits derive from having the most competitive predictions, in other words, the most certain predictions. And this means that all of their economic imperatives drive toward making human behavior more certain, more predictable. And that's why computational governments is such an angry and dangerous future, because what it means is that all of the machine systems are geared toward tuning and hurting, manipulating and modifying human behavior to make it more predictable, to make it more certain, because that is what is most commercially successful, most commercially lucrative. And that becomes the world that we live in.
So we're getting closer now to how you understand power and the type of power that is inherent in surveillance capitalism. And I think what you raise now shows an interesting tension I'd like to explore a bit.
Yes, please.
On the one hand, there is this idea, or at least we often hear the idea, that this is really about an objective analysis of who we are. And we have these statements also. If Facebook has 70 likes, it knows you better than your roommate or your family member does. And at the same time, and I think that's what you're also mentioning now, it's not really about us. It's a much more impersonal form, and well, yeah, we're the abandoned carcass. What it's about is something different. You're describing here this way actually between the knowledge that is produced from these data is actually also really a tool of power. It's a form of control. You say herding. It's making us more predictable. I mean, this raises the analogy of a classical thinker of the nexus between power and knowledge, Michel Foucault said, well, it's not really about, in modern societies, about this knowledge is not about an accurate representation. It's more about being able to manipulate us better. So, okay, so how is this happening? And that's I think something that's also in your book that comes across a lot. Even with things where you might say, well, the knowledge behind this is quite dubious, say like emotion detection or all these personality tests. So how would you describe this idea of trying to have an objective picture of the world, while at the same time being a tool of control?
Well, it's fascinating how much we have habituated to these dynamics, which are in fact fundamentally anti-democratic and fundamentally anti-human, to be even more to the point. But so, we talk about targeting, right? Targeting is some kind of technical term, some kind of operational term. It doesn't carry any real moral valence, or it hides its real meaning. Point is that targeting is a euphemism, and it's a euphemism for what I've called instrumentarian power. So, when data scientists talk about machine systems, they talk about a shift from what they call monitoring to actuation, where you know so much about a machine system at some point that you can actually control it remotely. You can actuate it, you can, have it do this or have it do that without having to be there, without having to interact with it. That is the position that surveillance capitalism aims for vis-a-vis society. Already plenty of examples of it. We can get into that. So the point now is that when we talk about targeting, we're talking about specific machine operations that have been invented as the expression and application of this instrumentarian power, this ability to actuate human behavior individually and at scale, at collective scale. So for example, targeting includes things like subliminal cues, engineered social comparison dynamics, psychological micro-targeting, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification, and a whole raft of other capabilities. So these are very specific machine operations that direct certain kinds of content to a very distinct behavioral profile of an individual or a group. So we can see these being targeted at people, these kinds of targeting mechanisms being aimed at people, certainly in the commercial realm for the sake of sales. But increasingly, we see that the exact same operations are aimed at people in the political realm for the sake of attitudes, political attitudes, and political behaviors. And we know that this also has powerful effect. And so the bottom line here is that by allowing them to extract at massive scale from our lives, to turn that raw material into behavioral data about us, they are able to accrue power to, you talk about Foucault. Foucault juxtaposes knowledge and power. Sometimes he writes it as one word, knowledge, power. This is the transformation of knowledge into power. As Foucault and others have recognized, this is the alchemist's dream. This is supposed to be a fantasy, not reality, but in fact, it is reality. The transformation of knowledge into power. That's what targeting is, folks. So, so we see this transformation of knowledge into power, and that creates these worlds, whether they're aimed at commercial outcomes, whether they're aimed at political outcomes, whether they're aimed at our behavior in the city, whether they're aimed at our behavior in our automobiles, whether they're aimed at our behavior in our homes. These are protocols now that are called into action to control and direct human behavior at the level of the individual as well as at great scale. None of it would be possible without extraction at scale and the ability to pivot that extraction to analysis and prediction at a scale that is literally unprecedented and therefore almost unimaginable.
When we spoke before, you mentioned new research on how this targeting was used by the Trump campaign. Can you explain?
Well, I think that we've become more and more savvy about the fact that this apparatus is turned to political outcomes and now has the ability to manipulate whole populations. As world citizens, we became aware of this, I think, first most blatantly with the Cambridge Analytica revelations, and we saw that something was happening with, what we thought were these sort of normal targeting mechanisms being shifted to political attitudes and behavior to a very dangerous consequence. We know now, Haroon, that in 2016, the Trump campaign used Facebook, normal tools, all the things we've been talking about, its ability to agglomerate a huge amount of personal information, to do it secretly outside of our awareness, and to pivot that to a whole range of targeting mechanisms, specifically in the 2016 Trump campaign. And this was a story that was broken by the investigative news team at Channel 4 News in London. In fact, one of the same teams that broke the Cambridge Analytica story in 2018. Anyway, in 2020, they broke this story in September of that year. And they came into ownership of 5,000 data sets that were leaked to them. And these 5,000 data sets were a couple of terabytes of data. This was a huge, vast scale of data. And with these data sets, they also came into ownership of, into possession of the algorithmic models and analyses that were used to target the people in these data sets, which encompass 200 million American citizens, 200 million American voters. Specifically, I want to focus on the fact that out of these 200 million voters with this huge amount of data, they were able to identify the group of people least likely to vote for Mr. Trump. They identified that as an audience, a specific audience, and they labeled that audience deterrence. That audience, it turns out, was the population of that audience, 54.6% of that audience were people of color, and that included 3.5 million Black Americans. People of color and Black Americans specifically targeted for deterrence. And they did this around the country, but they did it.
There is a problem with the connection.
In the swing states, those critical swing states, especially Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio, which of course were the states that were the make or break states for the election in 2016. Ultimately, we know that Black American citizens were targeted with the whole range of algorithmic mechanisms that I described earlier. Not only were they messaged with inflammatory and disinformation to create a negative view of Hillary Clinton, but they were also targeted with the range of algorithmic tricks to get them to believe that the way they could register their protest in 2016 was to refrain from going to the polls at all, refrain from going to the polls. And now we know subsequently, and I'm going to cite some research that was done by the Pew Research folks, that subsequently we learned that indeed the 2016 Black voter turnout was the largest decline of Black voter turnout in 20 years.
Wow.
A 7 percentage point decline in Black voter turnout. We hadn't seen anything like that in the last 20 years. And even more specifically, and this comes from the Washington Post, in those key swing states I mentioned, there was a 5.3 percentage point decline compared to a 4.3 decline overall across the country. So a whole additional point in those states where we know that the targeting was most intense. So finally, Haroon, what is the point I want to make that I want everybody to think about? We see that our precious American citizens, our Black American citizens, were persuaded to relinquish their most sacred democratic right, which is the right to vote, the right to self-govern. And they did this, Haroon, without anyone ever showing up at their door with a gun, without anyone ever threatening to drag them to the gulag or the camp. They did this, Haroon, on the strength of the inflammatory, crazy messaging that they were bombarded with over and over through the digital milieu, through the digital architecture, through digital instrumentation. This is the power of instrumentarianism, to get us to do things without our ever knowing that this power is working on us. It's hidden, it's invisible, and yet it can shift our behavior in ways that have profound consequence. This is not a society or a future that any of us want.
This clearly shows, I mean, the extent of this different type of power that is emerging here. I see in at the tablet here that many people are sense the urgency here and are really wondering about what can be done about this. I have a question here by Sarah about laws. And she asks, how do you think laws like the European GDPR can stop or slow down the upcoming of surveillance capitalism?
All right, well, this is, of course, exactly what we need to be talking about now, because all roads toward remedies lead through politics, my friends. All roads lead to law. When you hear talk of, ethical AI, when you hear talk of, we can really just get these guys to, make some nicer decisions and be a little bit more moral and respect society and respect democracy. Don't fall for it, because all of those things are forms of rhetoric designed to extend the life of this self-regulatory economic paradigm that has, if anything, deserves the notion that your time is up. It is the self-regulation of these companies. So let's talk about where we are and what we have to do. We began a short conversation before about, comparing this world to the world of industrial civilization, information civilization to industrial civilization. And there is a very important comparison to make right now, because what I've just described to you and that has emerged over the past 2 decades of the 21st century, what this indicates is that we are in the very early days of we are in the very early days of information civilization. So we can compare this to the point of industrial civilization, where workers had no rights and consumers had no rights, and there were no laws to protect people from the huge concentrations of economic power and the monopolies, the cartels and the trusts. So early in industrial civilization, everything was given to the employers on the strength of their property rights. They had all the power. They had all the decision-making authority. They decided, when people worked and how they worked and under what conditions they worked and how many hours a day they worked. They decided whether or not children worked. They decided whether or not poisonous materials went into our food and our medicines, and we had no rights. We had no power. It was in my country, and of course earlier in Europe, in my country, it really wasn't until the 4th decade of the 20th century when we codified workers' rights and consumers' rights. We created those legislative frameworks and the institutions to oversee all of it. And we codified that in law. And that became the structure that allowed the rest of the 20th century to at least be compatible with democracy. Industrial capitalism and democracy became compatible. And in many of our democracies, the two of these things thrived in concert, but only because of the oversight of law and our systems of right. This is what we face now. We need the new systems of, we've been talking about concentrations of knowledge and knowledge being turned into power. These are the epistemic rights, which have been cornered and hoarded and declared as the corporate assets. So we need epistemic rights to come back to us as individuals and to our societies. Do we need data? Of course we do. But now, as sovereign individuals, we have to be the ones who decide what data about us is shared and for what purpose, what data remains private. Understand that privacy is an effect, not a cause. This brings us back to GDPR. Privacy can only exist if we first hang on to these, what until now have been natural or elemental or pre-political epistemic rights, where we decide what is known and what is private. So we need to codify in law epistemic rights, the rights to know. And then from there, we move on to the legislative frameworks that instantiate and oversee those rights in all domains. And then the institutions that are going to assure that rights and laws live in democracy's house and are overseen by public law, by democratic law and democratic lawmakers.
Yeah. And would this require,
yes.
I think that's something you argue in your book, a rethinking of many of the basic concepts that we normally have for regulating and thinking about the market, concepts like indeed how privacy works, monopoly, because to a large extent you might say what these companies are doing is really creating unprecedented situations, right? Where there's something you call an uncontract, which is doesn't really annul the position of the individual person within a contract. Some might even argue that there's something like, and I think I'm curious what you think about that. This anti-democratic force. One might even argue that surveillance capitalism, to an extent, is really something like a return to the pre-modern age of sometimes called digital feudalism. Right? Where in the modern age we were considered free individuals who could choose in politics, choose in the market, and now we're actually here at the mercy of big companies that own everything, and we're just like the feudal tenants in their property, all being treated differently according to their whims. So how can we make that transition, that this unprecedented situation, that we reassert these democratic rights within them?
All right. Well, I think, let me state three principles that are kind of easy to remember and we can take them away with us. The first principle is that democracy rules. And, one of the things that I've been taking aim at, Haroon, is the whole idea that there's something called cyberspace. I was always, struck by the fact that, Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google for many years, became chairman of Alphabet and continues to be the sort of spokesperson for the whole surveillance capitalist complex. He wrote a book in 2014, and on the first pages of that book, he says, the digital world, this is the last place where it's an ungoverned space and terrestrial laws do not apply. This has been a mythos, a rhetoric, another one of those gaslighting strategies that we've been exposed to for the last 2 decades. There is no such thing as cyberspace, folk. There is capital, there are machines, there are systems, there are a lot of smart people with a lot of science and a lot of know-how, but there is no cyberspace. Everything that we fight for in democracy, our fundamental rights in our democracies must adhere in every space, in every domain. There are no exceptions. This world of surveillance capitalism has only been able to prosper for 20 years because there has been no law to impede it. We can no longer claim the ignorance that we claimed, that we could legitimately claim, 10 and 15 and 20 years ago, because all of this was done through surveillance. And we didn't understand it. We couldn't see it and we couldn't understand it. Now we do. So the first thing that happens is we must insist on law. This can no longer be an ungoverned space. The second thing that happens is we recognize that new assault on elemental rights are going to require new juridical rights. New rights must be codified. And this begins with the right to know. Just as we have, in my country, the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, we must codify the rights that have been assumed by us because we never thought that they would come under threat. But now they are under threat. If we don't turn them into law, if we don't codify them, they will be gone forever. All right. And then the third thing is that these unprecedented operations require unprecedented solutions. And that means that we have to interrupt and outlaw the wholesale extraction of human-generated data. It is fundamentally illegitimate and it must be outlawed. The markets that trade in human futures, that provide the financial incentives for massive scale extraction of human data, those markets themselves should be outlawed because we know their consequences are predictably pernicious. We outlaw other markets. We have outlawed markets that trade in human beings. We outlaw markets that trade in human organs because we know that their consequences violate democratic values and the moral aspirations of a democratic people. And we should outlaw commodity markets in human futures for exactly the same reasons. And in between these, the extraction operations that produce the supplies and the market operations that represent the demand, in between, we have these machine operations of targeting, the machine operations that translate knowledge into power, and these operations themselves must be altered. Once we ratchet down an extraction, we no longer have these huge concentrations of knowledge that can be turned into the psychological micro-targeting and the subliminal cues that can become, such dangerous tools to manipulate and modify our behavior. So in the middle, we're changing those operations so that the outcome goes something like this. Data collection is always and everywhere harnessed to fundamental rights. And data use is always and everywhere harnessed to public service and individual need.
There is a question here in the app.
We have fundamentally changed, rescued the data, rescued the digital, brought it back into democracy's house to serve us and to serve society. Please.
There's a question here in the app by Jan that also ties into this regulation of data. He has a question on the data tax. He said, should data be taxed as if it were, for example, oil?
As if it were what?
Oil. The comparison, I think, with the industrial capitalism we made before. Should there be a tax similarly on data?
Well, the whole data and oil thing is really important. But I think it's important to also recognize, in the case of oil, our enemy was the extractors of the oil,
not the
oil itself. In the case of data, our enemy are the extractors of data. So, we need to stop burning oil. That's true. But we don't need to stop using data. We want data. We need data. We want data to cure cancer, to make our communities healthier and happier places to live, to make our cities safer and better, and we need data to stop burning carbon. I mean, we need data for all kinds of reasons. But what we don't want are the extractors who, by extracting our data and then defending that critical original sin of extraction, they then have to corner all of the rights over the data, call it their private property, and use it for all of these downstream operations that we've been discussing. So let's preserve the data. Let's get rid of data extraction that is fundamentally illegitimate, and put the choices over data collection back under public law in the hands of individuals, communities, collectives, cities, and societies.
Yeah. So again, chase the puppet master rather than the puppets here. You mentioned we need to consider new rights for things that we took for granted but now are increasingly under pressure. In your book, you propose two new rights, the right to future tense and the right to sanctuary. What is at stake with these new rights?
Well, the right to sanctuary, the right to the future tense, the right to be forgotten, all of these rights without which we cannot live a human life, let alone a democratic life. All of these rights are examples of, what I'm now seeing as this larger category of epistemic rights. Epistemic meaning, everything to do with knowledge and knowing. So when it comes to the right to the future tense, when, think about the Black Americans that we talked about in the 2016 campaign who were targeting, their right to the future tense was taken from them because of this bombardment that used messaging derived from this depth of knowledge about each individual, use messaging to alter their behavior, and all of that happened outside of their awareness. So they were robbed of the right to the future tense, which is the right to decide what I shall do next, to promise myself what will be in my future and to fulfill that promise. As a citizen, I promise myself I'm going to vote, and only I can make that future come true. Surveillance capitalism intervened in that future under the auspices of the Trump campaign. So, and none of that would have been possible without having the knowledge in the first place. If the Trump campaign hadn't had those 5,000 data sets, they couldn't have had the targeting that would have robbed our voters of their right to the future tense. So I want you to see how all of these things are connected. When we talk about disinformation, when we talk about targeting, all of these things are interconnected with the original sin of extraction, which creates the conditions for all of these downstream operations that derive from it. So,
Sorry. Your explanation here of these rights, a question, forgive me as a philosopher, this is something I was interested while reading your book. I think the philosopher you mentioned most in your book is Hannah Arendt. I think in several crucial elements of your argument, you really draw on her work. Also here, with the idea of a right for a future tense, you quote her on the ability of making promises. But there's one thing I wonder, and to me it seems that there is like a change of focus if I compare her work with your work. And it seems to be that for Hannah Arendt, really she doesn't believe the private sphere is really that important, or at least it's more of a basis. For her, it's really about the public sphere that's at stake. It seems to me the focus, if I look at the rights you're describing and the way you explain them, your emphasis seems to be much more on the private sphere. The way you describe, for Hannah Arendt, promises is a promise made to someone else, and you're describing here a promise as one made to yourself. Right? So my question is, is it true that for you the focus is much more on an assault on the private sphere, say, than on the public sphere, if we compare that with Arendt? And why would that be the case? What changed?
Well, actually, I wouldn't agree with you that my focus is more on the private sphere than on the public sphere. You know, what I did in the book was I wanted to show that the assaults come from two directions. They come from above and they come from below. So in this part of the discussion about the right to the future tense, I'm really trying to unveil, trying to pull the curtain back on these assaults from below. Because when we talk about a threatened right to the future tense, we're talking about a threatened right to individual autonomy, to individual agency. What in the European, fundamental rights of the European Charter of Rights is referred to as dignity. Dignity embodies the notion of the agency and the autonomy, the sovereignty of the individual in a democratic society. So I want to show that these capabilities are being eroded from below, without which a democratic society is literally unimaginable. You can't run a democracy without human beings who have moral autonomy and a sense of agency. But at the same time, you know, I talk about surveillance capitalism in the book as a coup from above. Yeah. And the way in which these huge concentrations of knowledge and power, you know, create a different structure of society that deviates from the trajectory of modernity that has taken us toward more equal societies and more democracy. And now we see this digital milieu hijacked by surveillance capitalism, taking us in a direction of less equality, whole new axes of inequality based on these differentials of knowledge and the power that accrues to that knowledge. And so, this coup from above is throwing us back, as you mentioned, I write about, to a kind of feudal pattern of the elites vis-a-vis the many, and the priesthood, vis-a-vis the serfs. And so it is this merging of the two here, of the threats from both directions, that I try to call attention to in the book. And for Arendt herself, you know, I think she does dwell in the private sphere, perhaps more than you credit her for. Arendt was someone who understood that without politics, there is no freedom, there is no justice without politics. And she absolutely did direct her energies toward this unique vision of political life that she had. But I'm always struck at how much she allowed herself to explore the realms of indignity, explore the realms of the miraculous, explore the realms of the private kinship systems and the private experiences that flourish sheltered by private life, even in a totalitarian world. even in a world dominated by murder and terror and violence, how communities were able to find in private life spaces for sustenance and renewal that were then called upon to keep alive the values of freedom and justice that were being annihilated, you know, in the public sphere around them. So
Great. I mean,
there's a lot of complexity there that
which is also really
I value in her work.
I would love to explore this further. I also need to go a bit towards rounding off a bit. So let me just,
yes, of course.
One or two final things. You end the book, I mean, the question of what needs to be done. You describe this as we need to be the friction. We should not, I think this is also really Arendtian, not really fall for power and dare to challenge it. What has been your own experience at being the friction? So with your book, you're taking on quite powerful opponents. There's a really tremendous political process also going on here. We have a question here also from the audience. Han has asked a question. If you have spoken to people like Mark Zuckerberg about this. So a question is, with your work on this, how are you experiencing this, its effect on the public sphere, and how are you being heard?
Well, you know, given what I know about the companies and their leaders and their executives, the rhetorical strategies that they've worked on crafting and deploying for the last 2 decades. You know, I write about this a lot in the book, as you know, Haroon, the idea of the dispossession cycle. And, you know, they keep saying that they'll change, and then they change a label of something, and the phenomenon doesn't change. And so my theory of change from the beginning has been, I'm going to talk to everybody in the world who wants to understand this and who wants to change this. That's how we'll create change. There's very little point in my trying to persuade Mr. Zuckerberg, for example, because I have so much evidence to show, including in this past election cycle in my country, where Mr. Zuckerberg doubled down over and over and over again on the economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism, and choosing to double down on that, which of course means revenues, which of course means profit, which of course means growth, rather than what was necessary for society, for democracy, and for people. Even when it came to COVID disinformation, you know, the analysis now shows that at least as of late summer, when there were about 217,000 Americans that had died from COVID, analysis from Columbia University at that point showed that as few as 130,000 and as many as 210,000 of America's daughters and sons who died from COVID died unnecessarily, avoidable deaths. And when they outlined the 4 major reasons for those avoidable deaths, every single one of them comes back to this epistemic chaos, the just overwhelming of the system with disinformation about COVID, running down public health authorities, running down the public health guidelines, creating conspiracy theories about COVID, all of this stuff, which could have been stopped, but was not. So as far as I'm concerned, the way we create change, everybody, is we lock arms. There is a small group of people on planet Earth with a big vested interest in surveillance capitalism, but that is not most of us. If we want change, we lock arms. If we were all in a big hall together in Amsterdam, I would say, look at the person sitting on your left, look at the person sitting on your right, lock arms, form a group. Form a group in your student associations, in your universities. Form a group in your workplace, form a group in your neighborhood and community, form a group in your city. Go and discuss with your lawmakers. We want change. This is what we need. We need the rights, the laws, and the institutions that will create a democratic digital century. The liberal democracies have failed to do that. They have left a void that has been filled by a pernicious form of capitalism. We can change it. Nothing is inevitable. So right now, the effort is, to me, from all of us, the grassroots, our communities, we demand change, and we work with our lawmakers in partnership, in collaboration. Because, you know, the only people that our lawmakers hear from are the lobbyists that represent private surveillance capital. They are desperate to hear from us. They want to feel us at their back. They need us to give them cover. This work is already happening. You know, just last week, the European Commission published a set of guidelines on what would it look like to have democratic artificial intelligence, to have artificial intelligence that furthers the cause of democratic governance, democratic values and aspirations. It's happening. And it's happening because they are beginning to feel that we are fed up, that we are ready to say time's up. Because you look at so many surveys now, Haroon, and what we're seeing, and I'm certainly seeing it in my country, is a wholesale rupture of faith with these companies. Americans have lost faith with the tech sector. We're seeing this, shift in Europe too. And I think that we're ready now to link arms and make this change.
Thank you. A very hopeful message. Great. I think we've had this wonderful journey in about an hour where you explained us what surveillance capitalism is, how it's very similar to industrial capitalism, and how we also there need to mobilize the different types of new power it brings, and fantastically ending us also with what can be done, and also a hopeful message that we're actually moving in that direction. Thank you very much. Shoshana, Professor Zuboff, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Haroon, for your close reading of my book and a wonderful discussion. I appreciate it, and thanks to all who tuned in with us today.
Great. Thank you all, also everyone at home. It's been a pleasure to do this. The Brainwash Festival itself also will be held, as you know, from the 28th to the 31st of October. For more information on the program there, check out the website or sign up to the newsletter for that. Thank you very much and a good night.